Good morning. This is Visioning the Future, Artistic Doctorates in Ireland, and this is our online seminar series. You're very welcome this morning, and this is the first of our sessions which focuses on European folk influences, and today we're going to look in particular at artistic research in music. So today we're very pleased to have Paulo de Assis, and the chair for today is my colleague Triana Hoyne, who is head of the Department of Music at University College Cork. So I'm going to pass over to Triana now. Thank you, Triana.
Thank you, Jules. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Paulo de Assis to this research seminar today as part of the Visioning the Future series. To begin, we're going to look at two short videos on artistic research by Paulo de Assis. And I'd just like to ask participants to invite you to submit your questions to the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen in response to these videos, and Paulo will then be able to answer some of those questions later on in our discussion. So we'll begin now with the first video on artistic research.
One moment, please.
Reflecting on art, a philosopher from the 20th century wrote that perhaps art begins with the animal, at least with the animal that marks a territory and constructs a house. The moment you plant a vertical line in the desert, a singularity emerges that polarizes the space, creating forces of attraction and organization, zones of influence and interaction. The process of making and marking a territory is always situated, context-dependent and context-changing. Once an artwork defines a territory or stands on it, it is experienced by others who start interacting with it. Furthermore, art is measured, documented, analyzed. Obviously, art is the result of thought, reflection, and know-how. And art is also the object of studies after the fact, after the artist deposited something in the world. The previous slides are an example of the classical dualism between the artist, who makes the territory, and the analyst, who measures the territory. In this classical partition of labor, the worlds of the art maker and of the analyst have contrasting properties and goals. One aims at making a territory, the other at measuring that territory. One emphasizes free imagination, the other rigorous analysis. One focuses on experiencing affects, the other on finding meaning. One engages the nervous system with its vital movements, the other engages the brain, looking for stabilized formal relations. One insists on the subjective production of new relations, the other on objective articulation of knowledge. In short, one deals with sensation, the other with sense. In my view of artistic research precisely merges sense and sensation. It merges artistic practice and academic research. The artist researcher is someone who is marking new territories and constructing new houses, but that at the same time checks their precise contextualization, calibration, and articulation, also in relation to other modes of thinking and to other modes of generating knowledge. In this view, artistic research appears as a generator of experimental machines, articulating sense and sensation through experimentation.
Thank you. We will now play the second video, which is on research questions, objectives and projects.
One moment, please.
Questions are important, but questions do not necessarily precede a project in artistic research. Questions emerge as you develop and prepare a project, and they continue emerging as you are doing the project. In artistic research, one never stops having new questions. And more important than to have questions is to establish what I describe as a field of problematicity, a ground where problems, doubts, questions, ideas, hypotheses, analytical and creative solutions become thinkable. This is a space that enables the formation of a discourse with aesthetic and epistemic components. It is within such a space that questions are constructed and formulated. When thinking about research questions, it is helpful to distinguish between different kinds of questions. One kind are factual questions, questions that directly relate to facts. For example, when did Chopin compose his Waltz No. 1? This is the kind of question about which we might not know the precise answer immediately as we are talking, but we do know that there is an answer to it. And rather quickly, one will find out that Chopin's Waltz No. 1 was composed in 1831. We might also ask on which instrument and for whom was that particular waltz written. Again, we might not know it now, but we do know that there are answers to these questions. Thus, the first kind of questions, the factual questions, are questions about which we know that they have answers. Next, there is a type of questions that deal with formal, structural, measurable elements of a musical object. For example, which form has that particular waltz by Chopin? How is its harmonic progression organized? How are its metric and rhythmic relations arranged? Moreover, you can listen to recordings of that waltz made by different pianists and scrutinize their tempi, rubati, dynamics, etc. In this type of investigation, you are examining the materials from an analytical perspective. Therefore, these are analytical questions. They deal with measurable traits of a musical work. Again, these are questions that do have answers. We might not know them immediately, and there might be different answers according to which analytical tools you are using, but we do know that they have answers. Another type of questions are speculative questions. For example, one might wonder if there is a relation between the early 19th century waltz and the classical minuet. Is the waltz somehow a transformation of the minuet? This kind of questions is more speculative because there is no straightforward univocal yes or no answer to them. Instead of precise answers, such questions generate discursive constructions in which hypotheses do not need to be proved or denied, but simply discussed, eventually leading to new insights and ideas, which might be very interesting and illuminating, thus making knowledge advance. These three types of questions, factual, analytical, and speculative, are the normal kind of questions posed by music historiography, music analysis, music theory, music philosophy, or sociology of music. In order to formulate and answer such questions, you can, but you do not need to be a practitioner. You don't need to be an artist to address them. As a composer or as a performer, you can ask these kind of questions. But a non-practitioner can equally and successfully deal with them. But there is another kind of question that fundamentally requires artistry and a particular mode of dealing with music materials. For example, you might ask yourself how to turn a waltz into an object of discourse within a performance. How to unravel the processes of making and unmaking a waltz in front of an audience. How to move beyond repetitive reproduction or pedagogical transmission in a performative situation. Such questions are the distinctive questions of artistic research. More than providing quantifiable answers, they problematize the music materials in unforeseen ways. They contribute to an artistic and epistemic expansion of knowledge and experiences. These are creative questions. Questions about which we not only don't know if they have an answer, but which also necessarily demand artistic practice, artistic know-how, and the making of artistic outputs. To conclude, I want to stress that all these different kinds of questions are important to artistic research. The creative questions are certainly the crucial ones for artistic research, the ones where an artist researcher will make a difference. But you will get lots of information, ideas, and inspiration from the other three types of questions: the factual, the analytical, and the speculative. Thus, artistic research can benefit from conventional modes of research, yet it should clearly differentiate itself from them. And this can only happen through the use and development of artistic means. Once you have defined your area of research, your field of problematicity, your objectives should be the making of artistic outputs: performances, compositions, installations, recordings, web-based platforms, whatever. On your way towards such artistic realizations, you will collect many ideas and information that can be used for the writing of essays, for your doctoral or postdoctoral thesis, for spoken presentations and web-based communications. Finally, the design of a research project in artistic research is simply to give a logical and operational structure to all these components of your work, to your questions, your speculations, and your outputs. You will have to establish the basic landscape of your research, its context, your objects of inquiry, your case studies, and how they are situated in relation to each other in that landscape. And you will have to plan what to do with such objects, your outputs. This will inform your research in terms of background, methodologies, questions, objectives, and foreground. In this sense, the design of a project is pretty much like the writing of a book or of a musical piece. It is a composition made of different parts and materials that are brought together in a coherent network of problems, questions, content, and expression.
Thank you. Thank you. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Paulo de Assis to you now. I would like to say in person, but of course we're doing this virtually, so it's as good as in person. And thank you very much for joining us today, Paulo. As you know, Paulo is the professor and he's a research fellow in the Orpheus Institute. And Paulo is in many ways uniquely placed to introduce us and help us to explore the various tenets of artistic research due to the multifaceted nature of his own research, which includes musicology, performance, and experimental composition. And we got a flavour of that richness from both of these videos just now. Another point to note is that ELIA just recently nominated Dr. Paulo de Assis as candidate for the group of Chief Scientific Advisors to the European Commission. So we're in very good company today. Paulo, you're very welcome.
Well, thank you. I start by thank you, Jules and Triana, and also Ines for organizing all this. It's my pleasure. I would love to have been able to travel to Cork. I've never been there in South Ireland. That's a pity, but well, next time. Anyway, I'm very glad to be here, and please, today I hope to be less formal than in those videos, because those videos were for an online course, and we had a very strict dress code and the movement code, so I feel more free today. So I'm happy to answer any questions you might have from these videos or elsewhere, and eventually I can also show you some an article I published on the web. Could make sense later on in the discussion to show some bits of that. So I'm here to serve you. If you have questions, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Paulo. I might start with a few questions of my own coming from those videos. And the first thing, I suppose, is in an Irish context, as we discussed on Tuesday, there is a very interesting landscape for artistic research that includes traditional arts, composers, theatre, film. It's really, really multifaceted. But across all of those disciplines, one common thing is the sheer potentiality of artistic research for the development of thought, and the way the challenge that artistic research poses for more traditional forms of academic thought, but also how enriching that can be, and how artistic research can bring us as thinkers beyond what verbalization can even do. And one of the phrases that you mention in these videos is the field of problematicity. And I was wondering, could you talk a little bit more about that?
Oh yeah, in short, I said it in the video, but you know, I think this is very much my personal take on this. I have many colleagues that insist on the research questions, and they insist when you make a proposal or a PhD project, you must have very clearly written down research questions. And I understand there might be even some formal reasons why this is mandatory and it's necessary. But my point of view is a little bit different, because I think the idea of having a very clear question already implies that you will have a very clear answer. And in my eyes, the most interesting cases of research, not only in the arts, but also in physical sciences, are those where you actually know that you will not get a clear answer ever. Yeah? And if you look in particle physics or biochemistry today, they know that what we know today cannot actually be what it is. So there must be a sense that we are dealing with a field of problems which are real and constructed, and speculative is a combination of all of these. And this, what I call the field of problematicity, is much more richer than just to have questions. You know, always when I have a question, I'm implying that there is an answer. I'm implying in the question itself. That's because that's the game of language. You know, if I formulate in a word a question, if I really read carefully the formulation, the answer is there. So because our brain is always tricking us, yeah. So when I do a project in the beginning, I try not to start from questions, but rather from what kinds of things, for example, in my practice. Let's say if I'm sitting down composing a piece, normally we all experience this. There are moments, what shall I do next? We don't know. We are in a kind of problematic situation, which is a creative, a good situation. You know, if we always knew exactly what we're writing down, that would be very boring for the piece of music. So these moments we don't know. Or if I'm performing as a pianist, what shall I do with this section, with this passage? How shall I stage this? This do not knowing is much more important than to have a clear question. Then if I have a lot of these situations, I think it's not so difficult from a formal point of view to reduce some part of it to a question that I can put in the application proposal or I can show to a supervisor. But the most interesting thing is to remain very creative within your problems. The problems in a positive sense, again. Problem can be a good thing. And we don't need to solve all the problems we have. We need simply to continue moving forward, evolving in our artistic practice, in our lives. And questions, they will arise, but that should not be our main concern.
Thank you very much. It strikes me as well, following from that, that artistic research is so valuable in itself, but it also has something really important to offer traditional academics, in the sense that this very question about the importance of problems and not knowing what your answers are going to be before you start is something that has diminished somewhat in traditional research output, possibly because generally when, you know, PhD students are applying for funding, often the funding bodies like to get a sense that the answers are already there, or they're absolutely sure what the answer is going to look like. So possibly this reframes how we think of academic research as well, and that we move more towards a sense of embracing problems and embracing a sense of potentiality, embracing a sense of research being this space where things tremble in the balance. And so it's very useful to hear you talk about this field of problematicity, and I think that it seems to be a tenet that is foundational for artistic research, but also has such an enriching potential for how academics, maybe who aren't practitioners, begin to think of these things again. I think it possibly has the capacity to regenerate that. Also, I was just interested to hear, I know within the field of music, composition would be one of the oldest forms of artistic research, and you are a leading exponent of this yourself. But I'd be interested to hear about your perspective as a performer as well. And you mentioned in the video, you know, this idea of within, for example, Western art music, of going beyond a sense of mere reproduction, or going beyond a sense of maybe a calcified pedagogical approach. And you can see very clearly how engagement in historical sources and other trains of thought and other traditions of thought would be very, very conducive to that. In the traditional arts, this, I suppose, outside of university walls, often there is never this sense of calcification, this recreative impulse of something that exists in a living tradition, as it were. But this also seems like, you know, a very big issue for me, this idea of how we can move to a living engagement with older repertoire as well. And I'd be interested to hear a little bit more of your perspective on that.
Right. Well, there I could have a very long answer. I've tried to summarize, because the crucial question here would be what do we consider as being the musical work? So we would need to reflect a little bit on the concept of art work in general. And one of the proposals I've been making in the last 10 years, it's published in my book, chapter 1 and 2, is precisely a new, if we may use the word, a new ontology for music, where a musical work, and I start by making these quotation marks immediately, because how we construct in our brains what is the musical work is indeed a construction, and is a construction based on many, many infinite components, many parts. You have the sketches that the composer, he or she, left. You have editions throughout time. And every musician knows there were editions, for example, in the 19th century. We used to have a smile about them. We laugh because they exaggerated, they changed things. Then in the 20th century, more editions, and you came to the idea of a perfect edition, the text, the original text, you know, it's an ideological construction also there. But you have all these editions. Then you have all the recordings. We all listen to the recordings. So if we are talking about Bach or Handel, we are unavoidably thinking all the recordings every one of us heard in our lives about those pieces. So then you have the text that people wrote about these pieces. And in my view, all these innumerable things are the component parts that are then somehow associated, arranged, collapsed in one pseudo-unity that every one of us constructs differently. So the same work is one thing for a musicologist, for a conductor, for a violinist, for a music sociologist. And we look at the same component parts that's completely different, or some parts we don't look, we look at others. So what a musical work is a multiplicity. It's made of almost infinite bits of information in different medium, different supports, differently coded, and we are dealing with all these things. So my proposal for performance is not to believe an ideological construction as an ur-text edition, but as a researcher, you look at all this landscape, all these materials, and you, with your creative mind and your creative fingers and hands and playing, you reconstruct something that you propose to your audience. You propose in the moment of the performance or in the installation. And then people will come. First, they don't know what they will see or listen. They don't know. Because today, if you go to a concert in Dublin or Berlin or Paris, you know what you will hear. If it's Mahler 6, you know what you'll hear. Come on, we know. So in my view, you don't know. Because every individual, every conductor, every performer will propose something new for that evening, for that moment. Yeah? And by doing this, you are just showing the openness of the materials that exist. So history becomes not an archive, but much more an infinite potential to develop your creativity. So for me, to compose or to perform becomes very similar. It's the same kind of activity. You are taking bits of the world and you are reassembling them and proposing them, exposing them. And very interesting, you expose also the contradictions between these materials. Because we know very often a sketch and an edition and a recording, it's all different, And it's, again, it's interesting to show this incoherence of the material. We believed for too long time that we needed coherence in the artistic. No, we also need coherence, and this is much more productive today if you are a creative listener, a creative receiver too. You want to be challenged. You want to have this new perspective on things and not aiming at the unit. This was the old world. Very clear, very stable, strong, and we all would worship those monuments. So I'm trying to demonumentalize, if you want, all these objects from the past and from the present, present the diversity, the creative incoherence. That's very interesting for me. So that's a bit my view. So we need to rethink what are artworks.
Thank you so much. It's so interesting to think of incoherence in that sense and how this resonates so much with that sense of liquidity that contemporary cells often have, also which also feeds into, as you say, creating an object of discourse through performance. Thank you so much, Paulo. At this stage, I'm afraid I'm having too much fun discussing these things with Paulo myself, and I would like to open up some questions to the attendees. And so I'd like to introduce Inês Bento Coelho, who is our postdoctoral researcher in this area. I'll hand over to Inês, who is fielding questions from you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Tina. We have a few questions from the audience, and some of them are related to the way on the second video that the questions are generated. So I've got a question here which talks about how you discuss the types of questions. And the question is, I wonder about the type of questions that cannot be asked in words at all. It seems to me that your examples that might be asked in artistic research were mostly at this in the presentation concept dependent, word dependent, but there seems to be also a lot of questions that are asked and answered without words, only through musical thought and activity. So I was wondering if you would like to expand on that, Paulo.
Sure. I think we all agree that words cannot express everything. But words can express a lot of things, a huge lot of things. And I insist, for example, with my PhD students, that we have to go as far as possible in our capacity of expression in words. Because words, when you put in words, is the thing that is the easiest way to communicate with others something, to make an argument and to show it, to give it to others for conversation, discussion, etc. The moment we arrive at that limit, when words can no longer help us, then I'm very happy to jump into the non-articulated forms of knowledge, communication, and transmission, for sure. What I think in artistic research sometimes happens, is a danger, is that people give up words too soon. They give up words in a moment where they could still use words. And very often this leads to some forms of more exotic kinds of appeal, things that are exposed, that are shown, where we clearly see that there is missing some criticality. Still think critically about what you are doing or what you are receiving. I mean, this criticality is crucial. And criticality is mainly a thing of articulated knowledge. You have to think through argumentation, counter-argumentation. So I repeat, words, I agree, cannot express everything, but they can express much more than we sometimes think they can. So go to the end, articulate as much and as well as you can, and then you convince the listener, the reader, the viewer, that you are entering another domain of communication. Then it's fine and it's necessary, and that's why I insist these creative questions are what differentiates the artistic research. Yeah? So you need to enter the pure creation, and at some point, of course, that you cannot articulate any longer in words. But never forget that artistic research is research. That's why in the first video I talk about artistic practice and academic research. And then you have artistic research. So artistic research remains research, and in order to communicate, I used to say also to my students, you have to produce an argument, you know, and the argument must be so that you write it down, you put it on a table, and you leave the room, and others come and find it on the table. And by reading what you left, we'll understand your field of problematicity. We'll know what kind of things you are dealing with. So by no means I am against non-words, not at all, but words are useful to a very big extent, and we should go to the limit. Very difficult, I know from all my students, because the writing process in itself is a creative situation, and you have to develop this. So my recommendation is don't give up too soon, because that's a kind of giving up one part of your work.
I'd like to pick up on that notion of how we use words to express ourselves, and I'm going to jump to a different question which relates a bit with what you were saying in terms of, okay, how we then communicate that to grant application. How can artistic research methodology and the problematicity that you spoke about be distilled into formulas of language that then allow grant assessors to understand these fields as transdisciplinary, transversal areas that we speak about when sometimes words are not enough? So I guess the question is exactly that: how my PhD students or postdoc students think through the way that they distill their approaches to artistic research into successful funding application, which are also often assessed by people who are not artist researchers. So again, the question of the words.
Yeah, I think very crucial point there is to be very clear, again, as clear as possible in the description of your case studies. The case studies, in this sense, are really important research questions, because in the case studies is where the reviewers will understand or not what you want to do. And this is a very important question. I mean, I'm also a member of several evaluation committees, and the question always pops up is, what the hell are they wanting to do? What they are planning to do? What is that they plan to do? And sometimes we don't understand. And when we don't understand, it's bad, because that's a very negative thing. So when you describe the case studies, they have to be very clear as possible in the beginning of the research. They will change, they will evolve, they will become something different. But at the beginning, you have to be as clear as possible. What kind of materials are you going to use? Are these sounds of the nature? Are these sounds of a symphonic orchestra? Are sounds of a solo instrument, your voice? What kind of sonic materials do you plan to work with? Then what you plan to do with this? Are you planning to do a 2-minute piece or a 20-hour piece or an installation or some, I don't know. You have to be as clear as possible. If you do that, the reader, the reviewer will become confident in the kind of work you propose to do. And you also have to be clear, as I mentioned, in the kind of outputs or outcomes you intend to generate. Because if that's not clear, you're working, but it's not clear where you will place your outcomes, what kind of format you will use, of medium you will use. It's very difficult to understand. So for me, even more important than the research question is precisely the case studies. They must be really well thought, and what kind of outcomes you plan to do. If this is clear, those guys reading the proposals, they will assess it positively. If those are not clear, that's a problem.
Going back to that question in terms of how you put your present your practice, there's also another question on examples of formats and modes of articulating artistic practice, and how might you unlock tactic knowledge and articulate that?
Not sure I understand. Can you repeat, please?
Yes, there's a question.
I'm losing contact.
Yeah, I'm just going to come in there just because I think
unlock tactic knowledge.
Okay. Ines, I don't think we heard all of that because I think we lost you there.
We lost.
Oh, hello, can you hear me? I think my internet connection is a little unstable. I would just like to pick up on whether you could give some examples of formats for articulating artistic practice. How might we articulate and unlock tactic knowledge? And yeah.
Okay. I think this gives me the perfect opportunity to show the article. It's on the web. I wanted to show because I think it helps clarifying precisely this point in the question. So, Michael, shall I share my screen, or you go on with the website?
Yes, Paulo, if you can share your screen.
So I think you have to grant me some co-administrative power.
Yeah, so click on share screen in your controls below.
Yeah, okay. There we are. And share should be working now.
Perfect.
Do you see my, yeah?
Yes.
Wait. Okay. So what you are watching now is a peer-reviewed article that I published some years ago already, but it's an interesting article from this perspective because when I did it, my main purpose was to convey an example of how artistic research can be presented. So that was one of the main motivations. So the article is about a piece by the Italian composer Luigi Nono, and the article has 7 modules, I call them, so there are 7 pages, so to speak, and the 7 pages, you can see these 7 circles with colors. Every circle, every color represents one of the pages you land in. Now, what are these 7 the 7 colors I'm presenting here. So if you see from left to right, I will show you now the pages in a little bit more detail, but just to start from left to right, you have the module 1. Can you see the black circle? It's called historiography. That module is thought as, so to speak, classical traditional research, musicology, if you want. The next module, archaeology, I start showing all the materials that make the piece. The third module, I show some analytical charts about the piece. I'll show you in a moment everything. But then in the last module, in the 7th, the red circle, you have a complete reinvention of the piece, where I did an orchestral version of a piece that originally is for one single piano. So what you have in the last module is more, so to speak, the creative moment in its pure form. So it's a complete retransformation of the piece and without words. So now I show you module number 1. Looks like this. So it's a typical musicological essay with a lot of information about the piece, when it was written, for whom, etc. The second module is just 2 videos of me talking about the material that we know about this piece. So you have the making of the piece, and then the performance unmaking, the folding and the unfolding, just video recordings. The third module, wait, I need to go here. Just a moment. Third module, you have me as a pianist playing the piece in different iterations of the piece. So I'm playing it very different ways. So you have only audio here. This module is no words, only audio. And by clicking the audio, you listen to those recordings. Then, just a moment. Oh gosh. Zoom was interfering with my page. And then, okay, at the last, you have the recording of the piece, which is only audio, and a very short program note I wrote for the piece. So what you have, again, to summarize, is from left to right, you have more traditional research and pure musical creativity on the left, on the right, on the red circle. So the whole exposition, this is on the Journal for Artistic Research. If you are familiar, Journal for Artistic Research, this was published there. You have a way to see very clearly how an artist researcher can operate in a more academic research way, the black circle, and a more artistic, creative way on the red, and all the scale in between. So if you have time, I think it's worth to look at this exposition from this perspective, to see how to present artistic research, and with words and without words. So it encapsulates many of the aspects that you have asked before.
Thank you, Paulo. That was really interesting. I think this ties in with a question we have from Helen Fallon, who has just raised her hand. Helen, would you like to ask your question? Michael can let you speak.
Hello, Ines, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you all right.
Thank you so much for this really wonderful seminar, and the conversation is raising so many interesting questions. The main one I have, I put it in the chat text as well, and it relates back to the earlier questions that Trina was asking Paulo, and it has to do with the notion of the archive. Now, if we're looking at composition and performance as a kind of a spectrum of the artwork, I suppose my question would be, where does the archive reside? You know, is it possible to think of the archive as part of a living tradition of practice as much as a recorded output? And if this is the case, what are the implications for artistic research and the trace that's such an important part of research and of research cultures?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think the archive is much more than just the physically available stuff we have in libraries or in museums, of course. there is intangible archive, and we all have, and from what I heard today from the beginning, in Ireland you have a huge intangible archive, very big, with what you are calling tradition, whatever is, I suppose it relates to that. So archive, I like the word used, traces, because traces is the ones reproduced, but traces also from the past, and these modes of inscription, they are written, but they are also non-written. They are clearly articulated codes and less clearly articulated unspoken rules. We all know about this. This is of the archive. I mean, Derrida would say this is all writing. Writing is not only the physical, you know, we write with a pen, but writing is also the orality, and all these codes we have in our minds, they are part of writing in Derrida's sense, and I much agree with him on that. So the archive is much bigger in a way than we might think in the first moment. But then the archive, in my view, requires the other side of the coin of the archive is what I call the diagram. So the archive are the things that somehow are actualized, that we can retrieve, be them physical or tangible or intangible, but we can, as a community, you know, a community agrees on a lot of intangible things. A country, a community, city, a continent, we agree in a lot of things that are not articulated in words. But then is what I call the diagrammatic function becomes very crucial, is how all these component parts of the archive, how they are linked together, how are they connected, how are they rearranged permanently, yeah? And I mean, we just saw the last 5 months, almost everything in our life was completely rearranged in an unforeseen, completely unpredictable ways. You know, in February I was still playing in Oslo, a performance, very traditional. So this is unthinkable now. So it's this diagrammatic function, how you connect the points of the archive. The archive somehow is there, be it tangible or intangible. There is a kind of agreement, we agree what is our archive, but the connections, they are changing constantly, and sometimes they change very rapidly, as in the last months. And so we as a community, as a group, we have to permanently rethink, and this is the diagrammatic. So you are always changing the appearance of the archive. And still the components of the archive are the same, and they have been there for a long time, or we are making them, but so the archive does not exist without the diagram that allows us to perceive it, to read it, to expose it, yeah? So that's a bit my answer, but this is for me a very crucial point, so I like the question, because I think the question of archive, diagram, and unarchiving are very contemporary questions, and it's not only our, and it is the future, what we intend to do with all the infinite materials we have today at our disposal. Yeah, we never had so many materials available, so many archives, yeah, and this is a problem. We face a good problem again. It's a good thing we have this problem.
Thank you, Paulo. Helen is just saying that this is yet an important expansion of the concept of the archive for artistic research. So I'm going to jump back at the beginning and go back to your initial videos where you talk about the dualism between the artist, the researcher, the academy, the artist. And the question is, so actually about the second video on the different kinds of research questions. So they actually seem to be based on a dualism, research questions based on this dualism between the artist and the known artist. So the question is, can you say more about what do you mean by artist, and can you problematize that dualism?
Okay, that's also a very good question. We could stay here for 2 days, because you are asking what is an artist. Yeah, and today again we are redefining all this, so it's a very difficult question. I don't think anybody has a clear answer today for this question. One thing we face, one problem, is that most of us, we were still trained in the art schools, in the conservatory, music schools and art schools. We are still trained in a model from the 19th century. So we have to learn a lot of skills, a lot of virtuosic kind of things we have to master. We have to control our body, our minds. We have to, also the composer, we have to know a lot of things about every single instrument. So this is all the system of the 19th century, which was associated with a particular understanding of what an artwork is. That's why, as I said in my first answer, we have to rethink very fundamentally what we consider to be an artwork in all forms of art. And so the problem we have, and I think that's not such a good problem, is that we are trained, let's say, in the 19th century, and we find ourselves in the 21st century with these infinite archives. You know, the 19th century basically believed we could synthesize, we could come to a resolution of the problems. You know, there was a sense of history that will lead us to a fantastic future where everything is clear and sorted out and hygienic and transparent. Yeah? And then came the 20th century, proved this was completely wrong and we produced horrible things. And now in the 21st century, we know we have infinite sources, infinite archives, infinite materials. So the whole idea of the 19th century has been, of course, it's completely not anymore pliable. You cannot use those models to produce art today, but still we are learning in schools the model of the 19th century. So in a way, we all, when we are 20s, we have to do what the 20th century did in 100 years, with the tradition, because tradition is being inflicted to us from early ages, you know, in the art schools. So how to overcome this is a difficult problem we face today in contemporary society. And my answer, part of the answer, it's a part of the answer, I don't think we have an answer. Part is that artistic research might play a very crucial role. When I look at art schools in the conventional sense, you know, like a music conservatoire or a painting academy, etc., I do not see anything really interesting happening today. I think interesting things are happening in artistic research. Give you an example in philosophy. I like philosophy. The interesting things today are not happening in the philosophy departments, not at all. They happen in departments of French studies, of post-colonial studies, gender studies. Their things are moving the reflection forward. In the philosophical departments, they are doing history of philosophy. That's not very creative. That will not help to deal with the difficulties we face in our contemporary world. So as philosophy is happening outside philosophical departments, I think the interesting things about art are happening outside art schools. And artistic research plays a fundamental role, I believe. I think we are doing the most challenging things. What once upon a time was called the avant-garde, you know, we don't believe anymore in avant-garde, but that role is now in artistic research, to fundamentally rethink, to propose new practices, new ways of thinking about things is in our hands more than others, yeah? So that's a little bit my answer to your question.
Thank you. So I think this is the moment that we'll have to round up and start to finish. We still have some more questions from the audience, but we are running out of time. Triona, I'd like to pass it on to you to close.
Thank you very much, Ines, and thank you, Paulo, most sincerely for joining us for this virtual forum today. And also, I would just like to thank all of the participants and the fascinating questions that we received. Unfortunately, we were not in a position to bring them all to Paulo today, but I would encourage you to follow up with Ines with any additional questions that you have so that the conversation can keep going once this seminar today comes to a close. So Paulo, thank you so much. And I'm going to hand over now to Jules just to round off the session.
Thank you, Triona. That's been a really lively, rich session, Triona and Paulo, and really interesting to kind of get that sense of the way that artistic research tangles, especially with writing. I'm really interested in that, especially how I've been trying to encourage my own PhD students to write poetically into their practice. So I hope that's something that we can come back to. And thank you all participants and people who've asked questions, and I'm sorry if we didn't get to your questions today. We will try to follow up with those. I'd like to encourage you to come to our next seminar, which is on artistic research in performance with the very wonderful Annette Orlando. So that's next Thursday, the 9th of July at 11 a.m. And remember that you need to register before to get sent your Zoom invite, but of course you all know that because you're here. So I'd just like to thank again everybody, but particularly Paulo for taking time to be with us today. And we look forward very much to welcoming you to Ireland and our very rich tradition here of traditional and experimental arts and the very unique way that those two things tangle together. So thank you also. Thank you. Thank you also, Inesh, and we'll see you all next week.